Welcome, everybody, and thank you so much to the teams that have made it to join us as we launch our campaign of Not Fit for Purpose today. Thank you to the media that is here, and thank you to the activists that have committed this cause since the total shutdown, and some of us even before that term. What we've invited and asked you to come and join us to talk to us about is the current act for the National Council. It was enacted in May 2024, and it is due to be implemented. And it is important that we engage with the detail of this act, what it means, where it lacks, and the dangers of going ahead with establishing the council. While we remain committed that we need a council to coordinate our fight against gender-based violence, it cannot be a council that is already set up. And the conversations and the engagement and the submissions that we have been doing throughout the sixth administration seems to have fallen into deaf ears. And we're finding ourselves in this situation. We're finding ourselves with a South Africa that is not setting itself up to fight the scourge against gender-based violence. It almost casts a doubt of how serious we are. We've declared this as a pandemic, but our actions are actually saying something else. So what we will be doing today, I'm joined by three panelists, and we need to get South Africans and the activists, the people that have really invested in this fight, understanding the fact, because we know that there are activists that have welcomed the council, and I think it is because they really did not pay attention to the detail and what it entails. So we're hoping today to really reflect on the defects. Diane will be doing that. Diane Deng, who is a human rights attorney and who has been actively involved since the total shutdown. She has followed the process. She has analyzed the clauses, and she's just going to be sharing on some of the defects. And then we've got Reverend Dr. Bukelo, who's joined us online. I'm not sure if she's up. Dr. Reverend Bukelo she's a former parliamentarian, so she understands the processes of crafting legislation. She has been actively, highlighting the gaps. She has been engaging in platforms that she's in, especially within the faith sector, which is called on to respond to gender-based violence. And she was just going to be sharing with us today, giving like a political socio-analysis of what this legislation means, and if it is not properly addressed, what are the implications of it? And then we're joined by Usmongile Ndashe, who also has been in the lead, a technical lead that has worked since the crafting of the 24 demands and through all phases. And what you'll be hearing from Smongile is a reflection of the process, really, and the experience of dealing with government, but mostly through the Department of Women, Youth and persons of disability, and the experience that got us to be where we are. And Smongile, we're actually looking to share the direction. So where to from here? We've made submissions to Parliament. We have done physical presentations to Parliament. We've tried to engage with the department, and yet we still find ourselves here. So Smongile, we're asking that you just reflect that. So so without any further delays, I think it is important, though, before we start, just to highlight how, when it was the total shutdown, it was thousands of women that get got. When government decided to host the first summit, they were able to mobilize and bring in thousands of people, more than 1,000 people together. The consultation process of crafting the NSP was taken to all 9 provinces, and people invested time reflecting and really inputting on what should be there, because the NSP was supposed to be setting itself apart from any other strategy we've had as a country. We've had strategies as a country to deal with gender-based violence before. This was setting itself apart in the fact that it was saying, this is not a government. It requires all shoulders on the deck. All shoulders on the deck based on key principles, respect, of collaboration, of meaningful participation, and government just does not seem to be consistent in applying. Summit 2, they were able to put us together. But when they consult on fundamental changes that they're making on the legislation, I actually looked at their submission to Parliament the other day. I think it was on the 29th of August, where they were reflecting on the number of consultations that they did. They could only account, no evidence since so far, for 4 provinces, and collectively it was 238. And I can tell you now, if you look at the process and the flow of decisions taken, those consultations were done prior to the decisions that have changed and deviated from the NSP. So that is a process thing that we need to really be considering. Diane, please can I hand over to you at this point? Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you very much for joining us. I think it's really important to welcome everyone in the room and online that have actively sought to understand what is happening in our country, who are directly affected and invested in the issue of gender-based violence in our country. I think the context that Pinky has given us is really useful, that the National Strategic Plan was a collective creation from all stakeholders across the spectrum: private sector, development partners, government, civil society, and consultations with the public themselves. What I will be doing today is doing a comparison of what the NSP essentially has alluded to and what was agreed upon with all stakeholders, and in comparison to the National Council on Gender-Based Violence and legislation. So while the National Council, I'm going to refer to it now as the NCGBF Act, it was intended to provide a robust framework to combat GBVF. And essentially, it's the engine of the vehicle to make sure the NSP is implemented. And whilst we have that, we are facing several critical elements within the NSP that have been removed or admitted from this legislation, essentially weakening the Council's capacity to achieve its intended goal. So, as Pinky has said, from the start, it is going to fail. And then we're going to sit with investment spent and hopes and promises that have been made, connected to people that are being affected every single day, every second. And so we are, as part of this campaign, trying to make people aware of what the issues are and help support and create a space where we can work together and hold our government accountable where they have made commitment to take this issue of GBVF seriously. So the first issue on the National Council Act is that there is an exclusion of a funding framework for the NSP on GBVF fund. One of the major elements of our NSP was the establishment of a dedicated national fund for GBVF. So we had wanted an NSP that's fully costed and fully funded. We can't say we're going to commit to do A, B, and C pillars, but there's no money to do so. What was intended was to provide the financial resources for GBVF prevention, support initiative, accountability, and everything else that ensures that the plan is cohesive and put together. However, this final act omits the mention of any fund, except to say there is a fund established for the operations of the fund, which is very different to a fund that is going to implement the program for our national strategic plan. So while it is argued by them that establishing a fund would require separate legislation, this omission currently within the framework for the council, without a clear process for allocating of resources, severely hampers its ability to implement the NSP and support GBVF-related programs. The second issue that I would like to highlight is the lack of empowered accountability mechanisms with integrated government performance indicators and consequence management. The NSP envisioned an institutional framework, and it was deliberately created as such that it would hold all role players accountable and empower people to demand accountability across government departments. It was not supposed to be tied to one mandate of a specific department, but also allowed to encourage collaboration and coordination across the sector. However, what we're sitting with now under the Council Act is that firstly, it lacks these empowered structures and weakens the ability to ensure government accountability and institutional readiness. As a matter of fact, in the current framework of the Act, the Council itself and its board has to report to the Minister of the Department of Women, Youth and Persons with Disabilities. And in the NSP, it was very clear, not acknowledging their big role in the NSP and its implementation as a stakeholder. It should not have been having such incredible oversight and powers, and which does away with this accountability was initially designed. The third is a diminished political leadership and exclusion of the presidency as the champion. The NSP had proposed that the council would have a political priority at the highest level of the president, with the president playing a central role as the champion of the National Council to elevate its authority and ensure that there is effective oversight and implementation. Now, this crucial aspect was removed from the legislation, also weakening the leadership structure. And now we are seeing that the Act lacks the symbolic and practical leadership that could come with direct presidential oversight. The fourth gap is a deviation from the NSP by reducing civil society's representation in the council. The NSP and the initial legislation of the bill at that time had initially said that the executive board would consist of 13 members, 7 from civil society and 6 from government departments at a ministerial level. Now, this balance was intentionally created to ensure that there was strong civil society representation and oversight. However, our final act has increased representation to 8 seats for government, leaving civil society with less so. And what we have seen is a significant shift in the influence of civil society and voice in this space. And more importantly, I think the manner of appointments in how civil society representatives will be appointed in the role should be highlighted. And that is that they will be appointed by the president along with the private sector, and it would be from a list of persons recommended by the National Assembly by way of a resolution with a supporting majority of members in the Assembly. Now, this is different to the original, where they said there will be a public process where they will nominate civil society representatives. And this was intentionally done to distinguish the fact that we have appropriate representatives from civil society that have a mandate from civil society versus somebody just claiming they come from the civil society space and actually might be there for nefarious personal gain. And we have seen this historically, unfortunately, with issues within the CGE, within processes with the appointment of the National Youth Development Agency Board, where we had to restart that process because there were problems with that process. And so essentially, we don't want to see these spaces and seats captured for either personal gain that is not truly reflective of the mandate of civil society. The fifth is the lack of local and provincial roles and structure. Now, the NSP highlights the need for including an obligation and inclusion of local and provincial levels of government as part of the structures that are going to implement the NSP and its strategy. And it also stressed that the provinces and municipalities should be actively involved in budgeting, planning, and monitoring these interventions. Now, what happened during the process of the bill is that government essentially tagged the NOW Act, the then National Council bill, at a national level, which is a Section 75 bill, as opposed to a Section 76 bill, which would have substantive impact on provinces and ensure that there is involvement of provinces and the municipality in that process. Now, that, because of the manner in which they tagged it, kind of short cuts and cut out that entire process. The omission leaves out essentially grassroots level organizations and communities that should have a say in this process, but also grassroots level government that is essentially essential for effective localized GBV prevention. The sixth point is around the removal of the IMC within the legislation. The NSP proposed the inclusion of the IMC to play a key role in facilitating political coordination, financial support, and policy input. The IMC was also tasked to oversee the implementation of the GBVF programs across the departments, ensuring that the council had the requisite environment to operate without undue influence or manipulation. However, this structure was removed from the legislation, and it essentially limits the council's ability to engage in government departments in a coordinated action, diminishing oversight capacity. Now, I pause to highlight that in a meeting held by the Department of Women in August this year, there was a presentation where they said they intended to still have the IMC, but that they were going to house it within the GBVF collective without any consultation, without mandate. So it's bizarre that in legislation, which they are supposed to, retrieve their obligations and powers from, number one, the IMC is removed from that process. But then in August, they say, we're going to add it back in and we're going to appoint this structure, which is highly problematic because nobody has agreed to this process. So our argument may be that they are in fact acting ultra vires of what their mandate is. The seventh is the weak regulatory framework absent timeframes. So the NSP had set out clear timeframes on when, it would be important to establish norms and standards for accountability and coordination across all stakeholders and governments. However, the Act does not specify timeframes for, firstly, drafting and implementing any regulations, and it also says that the minister who is tasked with this job may, in some circumstances where they feel appropriate, additional processes and regulations which are supposed to give full effect and instruction about how we implement the NSP and how that National Council is going to take place, that is missing. And so there are no clear directions about what these obligations are, but it's up to the minister and the department if they seem inappropriate. This is a concern because it will lead to delays and the risk of the council becoming dormant and effective. The Act also fails to provide strong mandate for local and provincial structures, limiting their ability to act effectively in implementing the NSP. Now, these are critical omissions from the Act that have resulted in a framework that appears underpowered and incapable of meeting the comprehensive goals laid out in our national strategic plan. Without strong accountability mechanisms, provincial, local involvement, adequate funding, and all these issues that I've highlighted will essentially lead to a toothless council that is not going to realistically be able to implement what we envision. I will stop. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kayan. I think what I am going to do, I am going to allow all the speakers to go, and then I'm going to ask you just jot down any questions that you have. Then at the end, I will then open the floor for questions. Let me hand over to you, to Reverend Dr. Bukelwa.
Thank you so much, and good morning to the media and good morning to everyone. I think Kayan has covered most of the issues, but I think what's important for us is that firstly, government must be honest in consultation, because consultation is key. If the president has said GBV is a pandemic, the action should be showing that it is a pandemic. That's the first instance. The second issue is, as Kayan has indicated, the tagging of the bill or the act as it is now is not correct, because GBV happens at local level and provincial level. And therefore, it's important that it be addressed as such. So the act has already been signed, and therefore there needs to be an amendment. Fortunately or unfortunately for us, as the not-for-purpose coalition, we're saying that now is the government of national unity, and they must show us that they are serious about taking GBV as a pandemic by amending this act. And all what Kayane has said, I agree fully with. But also, we need accountability. And I think what Kayane has just not mentioned is that language is very critical in legislation. And therefore, if there's a may, it means it depends on the wishes or how the minister feels and her department. And also such an issue as we had discussed during the consultations of the NSP cannot be left with one department. And therefore, the key issue here is one, the amendment of the act. The act needs to be amended because it has already been signed, and therefore it must be amended. Two, the language, the may must be removed, and there must be a must. Three, adherence to the time frames, because we can't have 2025 June or August, we're still talking about the same NSP, because this is an important council. It's a council that's critical. And the last issue for myself is the issue of political interference. We cannot have, because as agreed before, is that the members of the council can only be done by a public process. And therefore, if then they are going to be appointed through the National Assembly, and it means there will be interference, that is for sure. We know our country, we've been here for 30 years. So we have seen it with other organizations. So I think it's important for us, for this act to be amended. And without it being amended, we're going nowhere. And also government to negotiate with the public and the civil society and private companies and so on in good faith. Because as it is now, they have changed so much, as Kayane has put it. So for me, it's important that the agency becomes the amendment of the act so that it covers everything that we had discussed, but also the regulations within a certain time frames be set up. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Reverend. I think it's really clear that we are advocating that the current act is not fit for purpose. We are still hopeful that government will get a realization of this and act on it. But should they not, I think we are at a phase where we've got to say, then what? You know, this is where we are now. We have really put ourselves out there, we've engaged, and we'll continue to engage because this affects us on a daily basis, right? Wongile, please can I hand over to you now to say, Lapam.
Thank you. Kayane and the Reverend have gone through what is wrong with this current legislation that was adopted. When we started engaging with government, especially on the second presidential summit, which focused on accountability, we welcomed the invitation to engage, even though we were feeling a lot of fatigue from the endless summits that are convened by the president. Having agreed to engage there, one of the attractive things about engaging with government, where ministers and other high-ranking officials in various government departments came to the public to account, was because we were looking for alternative ways of holding government to account without necessarily going to court. Because we wanted them to be able to say that this is what has gone wrong and that this is how they were going to fix it. So when we emerged from the second presidential summit, we had adopted the resolution on how we were going to move forward with the very same national strategic plan. On the eve of that summit, we received a draft bill that had been published. There were concerns about it, but we still left the summit feeling that the commitments that were made by government, we were going to fix this bill. And that Parliament, because the Speaker of Parliament was there, were going to pay attention to the things that were there. This has not happened, and now we are forced increasingly and violently by government to approach the courts, because they are basically telling us that they are incapable of holding themselves accountable without a court order. So if we decide to go to court, this route that we are being pushed to, what are we going to say to court? I am going to focus on 3 arguments that we are developing based on what has been communicated, all of these things that are wrong. We are looking at 3 things. The first one is about disregarding participatory democracy. We have engaged on this from 2018. It's been 6 years. There's a state failure to protect through lack of meaningful engagement and public participation in the legislative process. At the beginning, Pinky mentioned the painstaking process that people went through in order to make submissions and to organize themselves to say, this is what we would like to see emerge from this process. So I'll go back to this, I'll mention the 3 of them and then go through each argument in turn. The lack of a resourcing strategy. So this is about the funding mechanism. Here we are saying that there is a state failure to protect by deviating from commitments to ensure adequate resources to address gender-based violence and femicide. And the third argument that we are making is around the weak institutional mechanism that we have been given. And here we are saying that there is the failure of the state to protect by establishing a weak structure that is disempowered and incapable of ensuring accountability. And that is why we are saying that this legislation is not fit for purpose. Where I am going to land, so is that there is this litigation that's been proposed, and then that there are still other 2 things that are possible as a resolution to where we find yourself and we find ourselves. So starting with the first point on disregarding participatory democracy. The state's duty to legislate involves this meaningful public participation and engagement with relevant stakeholders in the legislative process. Public participation should not be tokenistic, and Parliament should genuinely consider public input, as neglecting this would render the legislative process invalid. For participation to be genuine, it must be inclusive and accessible to all, including marginalized groups, such as women and victims of violence. If public participation is superficial, then these are the things that are lacking. This legislation may be argued to fall short of meeting the standard of meaningful public participation. So in this case, we have engaged since 2018. We have the National Strategic Plan, which is a consensus document, which provided a very clear roadmap to guide the substantive content of this legislation that we now have. So we didn't just start with drafting a legislation. There is the National Strategic Plan of 2020, which tells us to go and pass legislation, but it's already provided a framework of what must be in this legislation. However, the final product, the state has deviated, from these substantive commitments by enacting a law that significantly falls short of the standards that are set out in the NSP. When we look at the public hearings that were conducted by Parliament, we can see that the concerns raised by CSO questioning why the bill was deviating from agreed commitments were disregarded by Parliament. Then we also see that there were major substantive changes that were made to the bill, such as reducing the CSO's representation in the council, without subjecting this bill to further public participation. Because when we commented on this legislation, we didn't have these numbers. After we made submissions, then they went and made further changes. Additionally, the removal of the Interministerial Committee, which was initially included in the earlier drafts of the bill, was a material change in the bill which limits cross-departmental coordination. The incorrect tagging that we have talked about of Section 75, which undermines the intent for decentralizing responsibility and limited wider public participation at the provincial and local levels. And yet the NSP highlighted the need of involvement of all levels of government. So the South African government's obligation to engage meaningfully in the legislative process is also underpinned by its international obligations. International law tells us that the law addressing gender-based violence and femicide must be developed in consultation with CSO, community stakeholders, and survivors of violence to ensure their effectiveness. The failure to incorporate perspectives of these key stakeholders undermines the law's ability to meet its objectives. Finally, the CSOs play a vital role in facilitating this public engagement, and that's why we worked so hard in good faith to participate in these parliamentary hearings. Many CSOs represent communities to ensure that their voices are heard in legislative discussion, advocating for the needs and experiences of those that are affected by violence. The need for public engagement in lawmaking is also a sustainable development goal, which highlights the importance of inclusive institutions. These international commitments, along with South Africa's constitutional and legislative frameworks, establish that public participation is not only essential for legitimacy, but it is a legal and moral imperative in the fight against gender-based violence and femicide. And so by ensuring that the laws addressing gender-based violence and femicide are shaped by meaningful participation, the state fulfills its constitutional obligation and international law to respect, protect, and promote the rights of all women and vulnerable populations, including children. So that's the first argument, that there was no meaningful public participation. The second argument is around the lack of a resourcing strategy. Here we are talking about the development of the fund resource gender-based violence. And to fulfill its obligation, protect any legislative, institutional, administrative measures adopted by the state must be sufficiently resourced. Without sufficient resources, laws risk becoming unenforceable. This legislation lacks clarity on the funding framework for responses and deviates from the NSP's categorical requirement for the establishment of a fund. The NSP outlined that resources, including financial, human, and technical, must align with the Council's mandate. However, the Act remains silent on this. The exclusion of this fund from the Act leaves the Council without a direct financial mechanism to ensure implementation of the strategy. Without ring-fenced funding for GBVF-related initiatives, the Council's activities may be severely constrained, leading to inefficiencies and delays in service delivery. And the NSPs foresaw a comprehensive resource allocation strategy across all levels of government. So the Act deviates from its commitments by failing to address the critical need for resources at national level, as well as distribution at local and provincial level. This lack of a framework to ensure adequate resources for GBVF can be argued as a violation of South Africa's obligations under international and also national law. Here, the CEDAW committee emphasized in its general recommendation number 28 on state obligations that states should allocate adequate resources. And at national level, South Africa has experienced significant challenges in enforcing gender-based violence and femicide laws. And the CEDAW committee has noted that this compromises South Africa's ability to meet its obligations under CEDAW and its international treaties. So, this is not only an obligation under international law. The South African Constitutional Court, in the case of Glenister versus the President, the Constitutional Court stressed that the state's obligation to ensure that institutions tasked with protecting constitutional rights are sufficiently resourced. The court noted that a failure to provide adequate resources undermines the state's ability to protect. The court also emphasized that independence, particularly financial autonomy, is essential for any institution responsible for overseeing critical issues. In this case, the court also emphasized that adequate financial and operational independence is crucial for institutions. So that's how we are developing the second argument, that the failure to develop the fund is still a failure to protect us, because how is the council going to work? The third argument is this weak institutional framework or mechanism that we have been given, a council that does not have the teeth to do its work, and this deviation from what the NSP said council should look like. Kayan mentioned all of these things. So what we are saying in our argument, Act lacks the necessary provisions to create a mechanism that is independent and capable of ensuring accountability as envisioned in the Act. What we co-created with the government when we were developing the NSP was an institutional framework that would hold all role players and stakeholders accountable, empowered to demand accountability across government departments. The NSP recommended that the council should not be tied to any single department's mandate, but rather encourage collaboration and coordination across sectors. This is not one. This Act removed the interministerial committee, a key entity designed to oversee government coordination. As we have seen, it established a disempowered council with weak institutional partners, significantly weakening the council's ability to ensure government accountability. The CEDAW is also instructive in this because it elaborates on state responsibility to establish or strengthen effective national machinery institutions and procedures at a high level of government and with adequate resources committed. So the CEDAW committee, because South Africa reports at the United Nations, has previously raised concern about South Africa's failure to implement comprehensive measures to address gender-based violence and femicide, identifying the absence of fully functioning institutions, which has led to failures in accountability. The Convention on the Rights of the Child has also emphasized the establishment of administrative, legal, and social structures to ensure accountability. South Africa's legal framework reinforces the need for accountability. These legal standards collectively demonstrate that for institutional standards to effectively address gender-based violence and framework, we must have institutions that are empowered to ensure. The NSP specifically outlined the need for a structure that holds stakeholders accountable. This was to ensure that the NSP operates with sufficient authority to enforce compliance and collaboration. The Act does not specify when the regulations must be drafted when enacted, leaving the law vulnerable to delays and inefficiency when rolling it out. The NSP also recommended that the Council's work must be supported by robust monitoring and evaluation systems at all levels of government, ensuring that the necessary infrastructure is in place to implement the law. What we are saying is that there has been a failure under the Constitution, and government should be accountable for that. We have gathered here today to say that this is becoming a possibility going to court. That's what I mean, because of the way government has engaged with. We have a meeting today with the minister in the Department of Women, Youth and Persons with Disability. It will be our first meeting to talk about this problem. We have been in endless and fruitful meetings with government, and we are not going to waste 6 more years. So we demand accountability, we demand clarity on how this law is going to be amended, and if we do not have that, then we are going to court. There is another strategy, but we are not convinced of its usefulness, but it's something that we've got in our toolbox. And this is advocacy to engage in post-legislative scrutiny process. It's not something that's they used a lot in South Africa. In fact, I don't know if it has been, but globally, when a piece of legislation has been passed, then it can go back, legislation inquired to Parliament, so that there is a scrutiny on whether this thing is actually capable of being enforced. And then Parliament can come up, with a review and then start doing that work. But all of these things requires people to engage in good faith. And that is what has been lacking. So people sitting here are from call to action. Call to action is this, with a mandate to do this, but not fit for purpose, not a call to action project. We want to build a broad-based coalition so that everyone who cares about gender-based violence and femicide gets behind this movement. We are talking to different stakeholders because this is what is at stake. This is too big to just be left to one movement or formation. And that's why we are here today to ask you to join the movement and also to call this out as not fit for purpose. And that's why we have spent time going through all of these things that are wrong with this legislation. We do know that government wants to fast track the establishment of this council. And we are asking people not to make themselves available because then that is complicit in failing victims of violence in the country by going there and putting their names forward for a structure that we can see belongs in a dustbin. So the National Council on Gender-Based Violence and Femicide Act is not fit for purpose. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Swangile. And it is important to highlight to civil society that we must be careful to give up now. We have come too far. The desperation of wanting to see progress might get some civil society organization to say, you know what, let's move, at least there is something. This is not something. This is not serving the intended purpose. It is not fit for purpose. What I'd like to do now is to just open the floor if there are any questions so that we provide clarity and request that we call out the civil society, join the not-for-purpose initiative. It is not individuals, it is not one organization. It requires all of us to demand that the 7th administration corrects what the 6th administration messed up. Yeah. Questions? Open for any questions? I'd like you to introduce yourself. Huh?
Should I?
It doesn't matter. Be comfortable.
My name is Sino Jacob, and I'm from the People First Media Unit, right? So my question, you basically asked my question, but it was gonna be about like, have we thought of alternatives ways to come up with solutions for the issues that have been touched on? Like, for example, the funding. But like, it has been mentioned that legal action will be taken, but like, can you give us like a glimpse or like how the procedure is gonna happen, and like in the end of that procedure, basically the issues that have been mentioned, are they actually gonna be faced, and what's gonna happen after the legal action phase? Because we need to be more practical. And I'm glad that you mentioned the legal action. I just want to know like how is the end result looking and the way forward after that.
I'd like to take a second question before we respond to that.
And my I just want to ask, what immediate
Should we take those? Swangile, please can we just maybe give alternative solutions to what end?
So let me start with the second question. I hope there's no next summit. We're not available. We're busy. So the president is the champion. That's what the National Strategic Plan, that's the framework. We are not saying he's the champion because he's the president of the country. The institutional framework adopted the National Strategic Plan says the champion of the response, which means that this is a person who has the ultimate responsibility to make sure that this thing works. Conversation with all stakeholders is that he has the responsibility. If there are people who are standing in the way of this cabinet or wherever, he has the right to hire and fire. That's it. So we want him to do what's right, and that is, we can't have a president who basically acts like he's powerless. You know, that there's nothing that he can do. He cannot come and say sweet nothings to us because he says all the right way, you know, but he does all the wrong things. He should not have signed this legislation because when he signed, we knew that was wrong. So by persisting, you know, with this toothless thing, it's basically saying to us, he does not take it serious. And so if he takes this thing that he has called the second pandemic serious, I'm amending this legislation is what should happen. Of course, he does not. Legislation is written by Parliament, but it's all the government departments that are involved to say we have to fix this, right? Engaging at that level, say that we cannot have this legislation. National was adopted in April of 2025. We have to do it. This is a halfway mark. What do we have to show for it? You know, in a country that says it is serious about addressing gender-based violence and femicide. Let the words be clear and emerge out. That's what we want from. If you have power, use it. The first question. The court order basically tells Parliament that this provision is inconsistent with the Constitution in this way. The way Kyan mentioned that this is what Parliament was supposed to do. A national strategic plan is not law. And that's why we are starting our case by making the point about public participation. And so when there has not been effective public participation, what the court can do is to basically say, declare this law invalid and say, go and restart, the process. So these are some of the things that are possible, to say you went and included provision at the end, and you did not give the public the opportunity to engage with these things where you were changing the percentages. Government now has got more and civil society has less. The other thing is Parliament can be given, so what happens is when the court can make a whole range of orders, but one of the things normally that happens with legislation is that they can suspend the invalidity of the provision and then give Parliament a period to fix, the problem in the legislation. So what we would like to see emerge if we go to court is that Parliament will take it seriously. And then when amending through a court order, then they do what's right, because you can hear from Kyan description that this is what was agreed to and this is what they do. This is what was agreed to because the work that has happened was to match it, that we had a roadmap. We had agreed, for the first time we came up with a national strategic plan that we were all proud of, happy about, and say, 2020, we understand there was COVID, so it came in at the time, hard lockdown. Maybe, our focus was elsewhere. But what is it now that everything has opened up and then you go and you deliberately just change things because these things are inexplicable. There hasn't been anyone who's issued a statement that says, this is why we needed to change this and do that. It basically looks and sounds malicious. And that is what we are fighting for, because if we are saying we're in this together, why would you remove the fund without even telling us that the fund is not there? Why would you not even look at cooperative governance? We are saying this is not only national, it's in provinces. Provinces need to respond, you remove it. Local government need to respond, you remove it. What is the point of this? Because all of these things, we put them there because we said, finally, we are going to co-create something that is the solution to the problem. So now every day we see stats, Human Science Research Council has released a report on gender-based violence and femicide. The numbers are increasing and we act like we do not know. We have a government that is not responding, and that's what we want you to know.
Okay, my name is Lucy from Channel Africa. And my question to you is, what feedback mechanisms are in place to incorporate the survivors' perspectives to your strategies and campaigns? How involved are the survivors in your strategies and your campaigns?
So right now, Call to Action is a collective of about 60 organizations, and these organizations have they are NGOs, and most of them have survivors and work with survivors. And so, as part of developing the work, Call to Action was also built on that, but there were survivors and there were organizations that work with survivors. And so, people who provide all manner of services from psychosocial, legal, and all of that. There are challenges, I think, in South Africa around the survivor movement. There are other countries that are way ahead in terms of how survivors, are organized, to work together. In South Africa, there are still those kind of anxieties about what does it mean to put people out there to tell their stories without the necessary, support. So I think there is a lot that can be done, and that is being done in other countries to have survivors organized by themselves as a constituency. But right now, survivors' voices are coming through the NGOs that they are part of and the ones that they are working for.
Second question. Oh, sorry. I have a second question. Do you feel the focus on rehabilitation of the survivors over perpetrators may be the reason why the crimes continue to rise? Because the law doesn't see a need to put an equal measure of attention in ensuring perpetrators not only suffer consequences but become rehabilitated after their, in jail.
Can I just clarify when you speak about rehabilitation, is that on the perpetrator or the survivor?
I mean, on both parties, because it's not enough just to rehabilitate the survivor. If the perpetrator comes out of prison, they're still the same. They're still going to commit the same crime. So then there's no decrease at all, because the root of the problem is the perpetrator. Essentially. Yeah.
That's a great question. So if you look at the National Strategic Plan, there are 6 pillars where it was intentionally designed to say what are the issues and factors contributing that holistically create an environment for GBVF in our country. There are specific pillars that look at prevention, the prevention model. There are specific pillars that look at the justice, the access to justice component. So that is, how our laws are failing survivors through the criminal justice system, etc. But there's also a pillar that deals with support services, and that, I believe, is where sort of rehabilitation falls under. So they have tried to develop a model where we look at things holistically, that we don't have a more of an equal focus on this. Resources, of course, has to be established, but there are specific targets in relation to each pillar and key bodies of work that have to be moved forward. And so in the NSP, there are timeframes for achieving those things, whether it be increasing something simple as, and it's related to your question, but prevention as something simple as looking at our environment, which is conducive to GBV from happening. Something simple as light structures, lighting in areas. Do we have sufficient programs around addressing toxic masculinity and violence in our society, where it's very patriarchal, and the perception of like ownership of women's bodies and how we relate to one another? All of this is actually built within the NSP. So I suppose, to answer your question in short, it would be really important to ensure that the funding is reflective of these priorities. And maybe just the final point, which isn't a question, but I'm going to sneak in there. We are harping on the issue and the importance of a funding mechanism within the council, because what's currently being flouted in narratives is that, oh, we do have a GBV. But the difference is that the GBV fund, which was an interim structure established during COVID around the time of the NSP coming out, is that it's private sector led. And so government's money is not coming through that fund. And so the question is, do we have a mechanism and a fund that is comprehensively pulling all resources? Because I do agree that government isn't the only person that's supposed to put resources in. Private sector and development partners are part of that. But we need to find a fund that actually pulls everything together cohesively, that is well coordinated. And right now, we've got sort of government doing their own thing, and there were reports that says that not all departments have embedded the NSP, so their budgets are a bit wishy-washy. So today, I might say I've committed 2 million for GBV interventions in the Department of Justice, but next week, if it's not ring-fenced and there's another emergency, I will just move those funds around, which is problematic because you're not having a holistic funding mechanism to support this plan.
And I think before I take another question, I think this is why it is important to have a council that coordinates what the different departments take. It is the current national strategy against gender-based violence was a very considered document. That is not only, yes, it is very focused on empowering the victim, but there are programs that are understanding that there are proposals in the strategy that are saying, there is access to justice, there is the perpetrator, there is the rehabilitation. They are factors that got the perpetrator to act in that way. By failing fundamentally on saying, how is all this work coordinated? How is the municipality that is responsible for safety within the town, for safe infrastructure, planning and interacting with this process? How is the justice department working? How is social department working? How is the health system working to make sure that should we present ourselves, in a clinic, you present yourself in a clinic, we all know what we go through. And the failure of having a structure that coordinates this, perpetuating this silo mentality and this lack of commitment. Like, the budgets of programs, they issue an IDP, they issue a provincial plan, they issue a national budget, something comes out, and those monies are transferred and moved to other things. And these programs, it's almost like we're in a treadmill, we're in the busyness, and we are not addressing what has got to be addressed, as set out in the NSP. What's our call to action? What important that people understand what the campaign is about. Let us get, it is in our interest. It is in our interest, not just as activists, it's in our interest as citizens. When we said it is our NSP, and when we march to the Joburg Stock Exchange to say private sector fund the fight, it was saying the response is not just a government response. Government must stop being arrogant. Government must do the right thing. The 7th administration has got an opportunity to correct what has been done wrong. And we call on all civil society organizations to, stand up for the right thing and make sure that we have a council that is fit for purpose. I'm not sure if Mokendo is still on the line. Is Reverend, are you still on the line with us?
Yes, I am.
Reverend, the few questions that we've had around the room, I'm not sure if you actually got them, because I understand that online is faint. But it was around alternative solutions. It was around what's the action? What are we then calling the action if something had to be done today? From your perspective, I just need to give you an opportunity to just reflect as we prepare to close.
I think it's important, all of what has been said. But I think what we need to do as civil society, especially the faith leaders, is to educate people on what we are trying to achieve. Because it will be like we're fighting with government. We're not fighting with government. We said what has been done and said in 2018 and confirmed in 2020, we are following that up. And we don't want this to be like the others to fail, like CGE and so on. We want this to succeed because the president has declared that GBVF is a pandemic. And so we need to educate the community so that when we go to court, when we march, when we do everything, the community buys into this, that this is a critical issue. And we are calling on government of the 7th administration as the government of national unity to prioritize this pandemic and correct what the 6th administration has hurriedly signed in as an act. So I think what's important for us is to educate so that everyone in South Africa is able to buy into what we are trying to do. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Reverend. Educate. Let's get civil society to understand the facts. Swangile, will you close for us? Are there any more questions that I might have missed? Are there any questions online? I think there is still a question.
Or you can't hear me, sorry. So the question that I wanted to ask is, what is your comprehensive plan to combat GBV in South Africa? Like, what programs would you implement?
The National Strategic Plan.
Okay.
I mean, our work, they've mentioned that we have 6 pillars in the National Strategic Plan. Pillar 1 is about accountability, leadership, and coordination of the response. And so that's our main focus now, that there must be leadership, coordination, and accountability. And that is why this issue of the legislation, this issue of the council is what we are engaged in. That's our program, to say that the response has to make sense at the highest level. And that's why we are talking about the interministerial coordination, the fund, the presidency, the legislation, the council, because this is what is going to lead, the response. So that's our program. We have members that are providing other services. Kayan works at Lawyers for Human Rights. They are going to court with victims of violence. So engaging with the criminal justice system. There are other organizations that are providing care, support, and healing, like shelters for victims, or helping to evacuate people from abusive relationships, organizations like Rise Up Against Gender-Based Violence and Femicide. So there are quite a number of people who are engaged everywhere. People who are doing education, to do that work. So these are just examples of some of what the members of the campaign are doing. But the focus of this is on pillar 1. Leadership, accountability, and coordination.
I'm a lawyer and I'm big on accountability. So I'm going to call myself out. I want to factually correct something I said earlier on. When I said the Department of Women in August had a meeting, their intention in their presentation was to appoint the NGBV collective as the secretariat.
Yes.
The IMC still remains out of the legislation, but in their presentation they did reference the IMC.
They did. Yeah,
so I just wanted to factually correct.
Yeah.
And this is important because my initial point about them acting outside of their scope and what the law and the legislation says, it still remains, is because there's Section 17 of the GBV Council, the National Council on GBV Act, says that in order for you to appoint the secretariat, it has to be done through the council's board. The Department of Women is not the council's board. In fact, we don't have a board currently. So how can you bypass all of those processes? So my principle was still good, but I did want to factually correct that they, at least in the presentation, they intend to appoint the secretariat as the NGB. Thank you for it.
They referred to it as the secretariat.
Yeah.
It was not presented as an intent.
No.
And even though it was highlighted, that was indication of the act. They
Yeah.
still.
This was like their plan.
It was, yeah. So it's not a plan. They've actually in their doing. So I think as next steps this afternoon we do have a meeting with the minister, which we're hoping will not be cancelled. Again, Yes, we do. Those that are available will attend the meeting. We will continuously be engaging on this matter. And we are seriously gearing ourselves to really go through with the legal process, while in the heart of our hearts, we are hoping we are not going to have to get there. But I think the core thing at the moment is the campaign is pursuing that the act must be amended.
Right now, the call to action, social media platforms have information about the campaign on X, formerly Twitter, and Facebook. We are moving to establish new social media links for the specific campaign. But at the moment, what we are asking people is to use their own social media platforms to popularize the not fit for purpose. This is on YouTube, the call to actions YouTube. Today's conversation was recorded. So you can go there and please share widely, because people do need to know that the law is not fit for purpose.
Thank you. Thank you.
You know what I also did while we were doing